When people tell you that they belong somewhere or don't belong, what is it they're really saying? What does it mean to belong? Well, I can't speak to what other people believe, but I can tell you about my sense of belonging here in Korea and where it's coming from. Hello there. It is a Saturday evening, just a little after 8:30. It's about 8:40, 8:45, something like that. We are at Eulji-ro, Eulji Street, named for a Korean general from way back when. And this here, these buildings here and over across the street, and this walkway here above us, this is all part of the Sewoon Plaza complex, which I did a video about a while back. This area seems like a good backdrop for the topic I want to talk about tonight. I've seen lately online some conversations, discussions about belonging in Korea, people who have lived here for a while saying that they are sure they'll never belong here. But it got me to thinking, you know, I've talked about belonging in past videos, but what does that mean? What does it mean when I say that I belong in Korea? That's something I didn't talk about, and I've realized through reading these discussions that people have different ideas about what that really means. Alex Room, cafe, and bar. I don't know what that is, but it's something that probably wouldn't have been here 30 years ago, and that's what I want to start with. I want to take you back in time in this area. Let's go back 35 years ago. This was an industrial area, and it still is to a large degree. You still have shops here that are making things, shops that are selling components to shops that make things, and some shops that are selling the finished products that are made. This place was completely industrial back then. There were no bars in the sense like Western bars. You would have had places to drink soju, that kind of thing. But now, you know, you've got these places where people sitting out on the street, outside cafes and stuff. Now imagine a restaurant owner in this area 30 years ago. The kinds of restaurants you would have seen here back then, they would have been, you know, standard Korean fare like kimchi stew or soybean paste soup, various rice dishes, whatever, you know, all kinds of Korean dishes, whatever you can think of. You probably would have seen restaurants here selling them. The restaurants would have been independently owned. Many of them would have been little tiny hole-in-the-wall places. So this area back then, people like me would have had no real reason to come here other than maybe to explore. And unfortunately, I wasn't interested in exploring places like this back then, which kind of sucks now in hindsight. Anytime I did walk through here 30 years ago, people looked at me like, what's this guy doing here? Because they just didn't expect foreigners to come through here. So it was strange to see somebody like me come through here. So imagine, if you will, a typical middle-aged restaurant owner, let's say a middle-aged woman, because back then most of the shop owners, restaurants and little marts and super, you know, the independent convenience stores, all that kind of stuff, they would have been middle-aged most likely, or older. I make shit art. So yeah, let's just imagine a 50, 60-year-old woman running a kimchi jjigae restaurant, a kimchi stew restaurant here. Her customer base would have been the people in these industrial spaces and anybody who had a reason to visit them. So she would have gotten up every morning or afternoon, as the case may be, and come to work in her restaurant, fully expecting that her customers for the day would have been local. No expectation whatsoever that somebody like me would be walking in. In fact, she could have expected the opposite, that nobody like me would have been walking in. Because it was just such a rare thing for people to even be in this area, people like me. Now think about that. A 50 or 60-year-old woman in the 1990s, she would have been a young adult when Park Chung-hee came to power. And she would have lived under Syngman-rhee before that, Lee Seung-man. So 2 successive dictators. And then she would have lived under Chun Doo-han. So her entire adult life would have been spent living under 3 successive dictators, under conditions that were more restrictive than they were in the 90s. She wouldn't have been able to travel freely. Most likely, she would have been born and raised somewhere outside of Seoul. I mean, it's possible she would have been born and raised in Seoul, but the majority of people I met back then, the middle-aged people I met, were born and raised outside of Seoul. It was very common. So she would have had practically no interactions with foreigners. And probably even after she came to Seoul, she wouldn't have had any. It was extremely rare. And so that also means she would have had a very, very basic level of English, if she had any English at all beyond hello and thank you. What is her reaction going to be if I walk into her restaurant one day? Well, I can give you a general idea. First of all, her head is going to be filled with stereotypes about foreigners, most of which are going to be untrue or very exaggerated. And when she first sees me, because I'm white, Baekgin, a white person, she's going to assume I'm American. In this case, she would be right. But to her, all white people are Americans. She is aware of Europe. She knows that there are Europeans around, but most of the white people in Korea are American, so that's the default assumption. If my hair is short, she's going to assume I'm a soldier. If my hair is long, she's going to assume I'm an English teacher. And if I'm wearing a suit, she's going to assume I'm a businessman, because those were the most likely possibilities when you met a foreigner in the 90s. She's going to assume I speak no Korean at all, which, again, was a safe assumption back then. How she responds to that is just going to be based on her personality, her life experience, her upbringing. Probably she's going to do her best to accommodate me, but she might be nervous because of her inability to speak English and my inability to speak Korean. And that might lead to some misunderstandings. She might try to go out of her way to make me feel comfortable, which could end up making me more uncomfortable. Oh, I just walked down this street a minute ago, this alley. But we went that way, so this time we go this way. Just walking in circles here. And one of the stereotypes she's going to believe is that I can't eat spicy food. But she's selling kimchi jjigae, so when I order kimchi jjigae, she's going to be really nervous now and try to convince me not to. She's going to try to let me know, oh, this is spicy, this kind of thing. If we do get past that point, then when she brings the food out, she might very well give me a fork based on the assumption that I'm not going to know how to use chopsticks. And all of these things I'm telling you, I'm not just speculating. These are things that actually used to happen to me pretty regularly back in the 90s. It was just standard, par for the course, walking into restaurants outside of Itaewon. And because I say outside of Itaewon, because here's the thing, I've mentioned this before, Itaewon was the center of the foreign community in the 90s, and everybody knew that. So anybody with a restaurant near Itaewon would expect to occasionally have to deal with foreigners. But anybody with a restaurant out here, far away from Itaewon, in an industrial area, would have no expectation of that whatsoever. Now, as I've been walking through here, you've seen, if you've been paying attention, and if I've done the job of showing my surroundings here, then you've seen some bars and places where people are sitting outside eating and drinking, and there's some cafes around. That's because this area has gone through a bit of a revitalization in recent years. Some of the shops that were here have shut down and moved out, and other, cafes and such have come in for the lower rents, the lower property values. And there was a revitalization project at Sewoon Plaza, which helped bring in some of these other businesses. And I should add that, we're not too far from Myeongdong. We're a short walk away from Myeongdong, and Myeongdong is a very popular tourist destination today. It's full of tourists. In the 90s, it was not. In the 90s, it was just a shopping district. It was full of Koreans. In the early 2000s, I remember that's probably when I started hearing a lot of Japanese being spoken around me when I was in Myeongdong. And then later it became a lot of Chinese. And then there was a period where I started hearing, more and more Southeast Asian languages when I was walking through Myeongdong. And now today, it's full of people from all over the world. So with Myeongdong being such a central focus of tourists, and you've got several other sites not far away, within walking distance of this area, and with the revitalization here, now a lot more people like me come through here. I mean, look at this place, juice and dessert. This kind of place would not have been here 30 years ago. But now you can find places like this all over here. You'll see pictures from this area, Eulji-ro Samga, they call it, the third block of Eulji-ro. Although technically, we're not on Eulji-ro now. This street, I can never remember the name of it, but it's not Eulji-ro. But yeah, this whole area now, you can find people visiting the restaurants, and there's a couple of speakeasies out here, I think, that are popular. I've seen them on YouTube. And there's another area that's a lot busier than this spot is, so it's not so crowded here. But if you come out here around 6, you'll see a lot more people. So now, a restaurant out here today, the owner is probably going to be younger. There are a lot of young shop owners out here now compared to what there used to be. I mean, you'll still find middle-aged people here, mostly in the older places, the older restaurants. But now you find a lot more than just the standard Korean fare. And here's one of those spaces, one of those working industrial spaces still going. So a shop owner out here today is going to expect that foreigners are going to come through here now, because they do. I mean, it happens, right? There is a reason for people like me to come out here now. And so the odds are good in shops in this area that you will find people who speak some English, who have some experience. interacting with foreigners, maybe even traveling. You figure even the middle-aged people today, that was the generation, my generation, Generation X, that was the generation, the first generation of Koreans that really started traveling the world once it became possible for people to freely travel. So even people who grew up in the countryside, you know, even if they didn't travel the world, they still have had more exposure to other cultures than past generations did. So when I walk into a shop in this area today, there's no assumption that I'm a soldier or an English teacher or a businessman. No, none of that anymore. The assumption today is that I'm a tourist. And that is a good assumption to make, because most of the foreigners that come through here, I don't know, many are tourists. Now that said, there are more foreigners living here today in Korea, more foreigners with permanent residency, but still the number of tourists greatly outweighs the number of people who live here, the number of foreigners who live here. And I'm telling you all this just so you can understand the context behind my experience here. Coming to Korea in the 90s, there were many areas like this where people treated you in the way I described. I mean, you would occasionally encounter people who would shoo you out of their restaurants just because they don't want to bother. They just assume that dealing with a foreigner is going to be a headache. They're not going to like the spicy food. They're not going to be able to use the chopsticks. They don't speak enough Korean, and I don't speak enough English, so I'm just going to tell them to go. There are other people who would be annoyed but tolerate you. You could tell they were annoyed. There were people who, like I said, would go out of their way to help you. And today, most people just treat you like a customer. Yeah. Often you walk into a shop today, they'll speak English to you right off the bat. Sometimes they'll speak Korean to you, but in this area, they're probably going to speak English to you just because there are so many tourists. And they're just going to assume that you're a tourist and not somebody who lives here. And I think I've mentioned this before, but you know, I would go in the past to somewhere like McDonald's, and the clerk at the cash register, I could see their eyes go big, and sometimes a look of sheer terror come to their faces, because they suddenly are afraid they have to speak English to me, and they're looking around for the one person on the team. There was usually always one who spoke English well enough to deal with the foreign customers. These days, you don't see that, right? It just doesn't happen anymore. And in places outside of the tourist areas, a lot of times people will speak Korean to me when I walk in. But let's face it, I'm not Korean. I mean, look at me. And it's going to be a little noisy over here, so let's go back this way. So what does that mean?
When I say
thank you, you too. So what does that mean for me in my daily life? Well, it means that people don't treat me like a Korean when they first see me. Why should they? I don't look Korean at all. It's very obvious I'm not Korean. So why should they think they should treat me like a Korean? A lot of little neighborhood supermarkets, they have a point system, right? Kind of a membership thing. Every time you go in, you give them your phone number or the last 4 digits of your phone number. And if it's registered, right, then a certain number of points will get credited to your account based on how much you purchased, right? So my wife has points at multiple little neighborhood supermarkets. So anytime I go into a supermarket, which is very rare these days actually, we normally order everything online or through our apps on our phone, but we do still occasionally go. And when I do go, when I'm standing in line at the cashier, I will hear the cashier ask every person in line in front of me, every Korean, if they have points. But when it comes my turn and I'm getting ready to pay, they don't ask me about the points. They just don't. The assumption is, I'm not Korean. Why would I have points? So I always have to mention it first. I just tell them, oh, points. And I give my wife's phone number because it's in her name. And then no problem. I go about my day. And if I go in there enough to that supermarket, they will recognize me. And once people recognize me, then they treat me just the same way they treat everybody else. Another example, let's say I'm somewhere in northeastern Seoul, off in Dobong district or something, and I walk into a little hole-in-the-wall restaurant there. And there's an older lady in there, an elderly lady. Well, walking into a place like that can sometimes be like being back in the 90s, because in that part of Seoul, there aren't a whole lot of foreigners walking into little hole-in-the-wall restaurants like that. And it's probably a good chance that, you know, an elderly woman in that restaurant doesn't have so much experience with foreigners. And so we go through that whole situation where she's worried about how to communicate with me. Or I walk into a restaurant somewhere outside of a tourist area and the staff starts speaking to me in English immediately. They don't even bother communicating in Korean. When I answer in Korean, well, okay, then they switch and we start talking in Korean. These are the consequences of being a non-Korean in Korea. And I am perfectly okay with that. I wouldn't expect people to treat me as if I were Korean. They can see that I'm not. It's obvious that I'm not. And yeah, in the past, I have gotten annoyed when I've walked into a cafe or something and people have spoken English to me instead of Korean, but I don't get annoyed by it anymore. And the reason I'm focusing on this concept of being treated like a foreigner rather than a Korean is because in these online conversations that I've seen discussing belonging in Korea, the examples people give of why they feel like they don't belong have to do with how they are treated by the Korean people. Again and again, I've read people complaining about these little things like the ones I just described, right? In fact, I mentioned in a comment I left, I dipped into one of these conversations and I wrote a few paragraphs about why I feel like I belong. And somebody came along and said, I think what most of the people are complaining about isn't about how they feel, it's about how Koreans treat them. And I gave some examples, like I just gave you, like about the points in the supermarkets and that kind of thing, of things that I think are minor annoyances, but I mean, they're valid, they are valid assumptions that people make. And let's face it, people all over the world make assumptions about people all the time, based on how they look, how they dress, what kind of car they drive, the color of their skin. It's what human beings do. And you can't expect Koreans to be any different because Koreans are human beings. So yeah, I think anybody living in Korea long term who expects to be treated like a Korean when you obviously are not Korean just has misplaced expectations. If that is what you feel you need to feel like you belong, then maybe you're in the wrong place. Because the thing I keep coming back to is there are always these initial assumptions that people make, and I understand why they make them. But once you get past that barrier, once you get past those initial assumptions, once they realize, oh, this guy speaks Korean, or oh, this guy understands Korean culture, he knows what's going on here, he knows how to eat spicy food, he knows this, he knows that. Once you get past all these assumptions, they treat you just like they treat anybody else. They just have to get to know you first. So I feel like there has to be a little bit of self-awareness there from people like me. You can't put all of the burden on Koreans to make you feel like you belong. It's a two-way street. Now, I am not going to presume to say that everybody who feels like they don't belong feels that way because they lack self-awareness or because they lack understanding. I'm not going to presume to say that. I can't talk to anybody else's experience. All I can speak to is my experience. And I can also say that it was many years before I realized that I felt like I belonged. You go back to the 90s, that scenario that I described in that kimchi jjigae restaurant, that was life for many years for me. People had less experience with foreigners back then. People were more awkward. Conversations tended to revolve around differences in culture. They were curious to learn about my culture, eager to tell me about theirs. Conversations that were just two people chatting about life and current events were rare for me when I was speaking with Koreans. There were scenarios that just repeated themselves when I met people for the first time. Taxi drivers always asked the same questions, and the questions were questions they didn't ask Koreans, of course. So this is why it's difficult for me to understand what's so hard about fitting into Korea today. Technology has brought the world so much closer together, right? It's made the world smaller. People who come to Korea today know a hell of a lot more about it than I did when I came to Korea in the 90s. Most people who came here knew very little about it. We had to learn about it as we lived here through daily life. But there are people who know more about K-pop than me who have never set foot in Korea. People who know more about Korean food than I do, it seems. It's just so much easier now. Koreans are so much more used to foreigners today than they were back then. So many more people speak English. There's so much more English around the city. I can give you dozens of reasons why I find it difficult to believe that anybody could have a hard time here. But again, I'm not in their shoes. I have context that they don't have. And all of that context that I have makes it difficult for me to see from their perspective. It's the curse of knowledge, right? And they don't have the context that I have to see how similar it is to their culture today versus how different it was 30 years ago. So I want to emphasize that I'm not here to, hate on anybody or to mock anybody or ding anybody for not feeling like they belong. But I just want to make the point that it is a two-way street. It takes a little bit of self-awareness. And I didn't have that for a long time. When I first got here, I'm embarrassed to say, I was the arrogant American. I had never been out of the country, out of America. This was my first foreign country. And I saw everything through the lens of somebody who had spent their entire life in the States. So I was critical and complained a lot. And it took me a while to get past that. And then it took me a while to get settled in. So when I say I belong, I guess what that really means is that I've made peace with not being a Korean. I am a non-Korean in a Korean world. And I am fine with that. And I value the friendships I have. I value the interactions that I have with strangers. I accept the assumptions people have about me with the understanding that when we get past them, everything's fine and we're just normal people. And I also appreciate when those assumptions get me out of trouble. Well, thank you for joining me on this rambling little walk and talk tonight. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you feel like you belong. If you want to hear more deep thoughts on my life in Korea, I've got a playlist of reflections right there.